You can have a growing bank account, a stable career, a responsible plan, and still be making one of the biggest mistakes of your life. Because most people aren't afraid of spending money, they're afraid of being unsafe. So they wait. They wait for the promotion. They wait for the right time. They wait until things feel more stable, more certain, more under control. And while they're waiting, life quietly moves, energy shifts, people change, opportunities expire. But from the outside, it looks smart, disciplined, responsible, like you're doing everything right. Until one day you realize you didn't waste money, you wasted timing. And if you're the kind of person who plans ahead, who thinks long-term, who likes being prepared, this is probably about you, not because you're reckless, not because you're lazy, not because you don't care about life, but because you've been rewarded for one thing your entire adult life: delaying. Delaying comfort, delaying fun, delaying rest, delaying the part where you actually enjoy what all this effort is supposed to be for. And to be fair, that discipline probably got you pretty far. It got you the job. It got you the savings account. It got you the respect. It got you the identity. You became the responsible one. The one who thinks ahead. The one who doesn't blow money. The one who doesn't make stupid decisions. And over time, that starts to feel like maturity. Like intelligence, like wisdom. But there's a version of that story almost nobody talks about, the version where your discipline quietly becomes your prison. Because there's a strange thing that happens to ambitious people. The better they get at building a future, the easier it becomes to abandon the present. Not dramatically. Not in a way that looks tragic, in a way that looks normal, professional, even admirable. You tell yourself you're just in a season. A busy season, a building season, a sacrifice season. And maybe that's true for a while. But then one season becomes three becomes 7. And before you know it, you've built a life where almost everything meaningful has been pushed into a vague category called later. Later, I'll travel more. Later, I'll slow down. Later, I'll spend more time with people. Later, I'll take that risk. Later, I'll actually enjoy what I've worked so hard for. And the reason this is dangerous is because it doesn't feel dangerous. It feels smart. That's what makes it so hard to catch. You don't wake up one morning and say, I'd like to accidentally waste the most alive years of my life. Nobody says that. What people say is, I'm just being responsible. I'm just making sure I'm secure. I'm just waiting until the timing is better. And if you've ever said any version of that, this book is probably going to bother you. Because Die with Zero is not really a money book. It wears the clothes of a money book. It talks about wealth, retirement, spending, inheritance. But underneath all of that, it's asking a much more personal question. A much more dangerous one. What are you actually saving your life for? And that question lands differently depending on who you are. If you're struggling to survive, this is not the book's audience. If you genuinely don't have breathing room, then your relationship with money is already brutally immediate. But if you are someone with some stability, some margin, some ability to choose, then this question becomes uncomfortable very fast because it forces you to ask something you may have avoided for years. Am I actually building a better life? Or am I just building a safer delay? That's the first crack in the whole system. And once you feel that crack, it's hard to unfeel it. Because then you start noticing things. You start noticing how often your life is built around preserving optionality without ever cashing any of it in. You start noticing how often your plans are designed to protect a future version of you at the expense of the current one. You start noticing how many people are doing well on paper while feeling strangely underlived in reality. They're not failing. That's the weird part. They're succeeding. They're just succeeding in a game they never stop to question. That's what makes this book powerful. It doesn't attack irresponsibility. It attacks autopilot. And autopilot is much harder to spot because it usually looks respectable. Work hard, save hard, delay gratification, retire, then live. That's the script. And if you say it quickly, it almost sounds noble. But if you slow it down, really slow it down, it starts to sound a little strange. Work through your healthiest years. Postpone your freest years. Protect a future you haven't met yet. Then hope your body, your relationships, your curiosity, and your appetite for life are all still waiting for you at the end. That's not obviously wise. That's just familiar. And familiar is dangerous. Because familiar ideas are the ones we stop testing. So let's test this one. Let's say you do everything right. You earn well. You invest consistently. You avoid lifestyle inflation. You don't make stupid financial mistakes. You become the kind of person who is set up. That sounds ideal. And maybe financially it is. But there's another question hidden inside it. What if you become financially optimized and experientially bankrupt? What if you become the kind of person who has a very secure future and a strangely postponed life? What if your bank account rises while your actual life keeps getting pushed into next year? That's not a dramatic tragedy. That's a quiet one. And quiet tragedies are often the ones people live inside for decades because they don't look like mistakes. They look like responsibility. There's a reason this lands so hard for high-functioning people, because the exact trait that helps you win in one area of life can quietly damage another. Delayed gratification is incredibly useful until it becomes your entire personality, until you no longer know how to enjoy something without first justifying it, until rest starts feeling irresponsible, until joy needs a spreadsheet, until every meaningful experience has to pass through the gate of "have I earned this yet?" That's where this gets personal. Because if you're honest, a lot of people are not delaying because they're strategic. They're delaying because it feels emotionally safer than fully living. And that is a completely different problem. Because now we're not talking about money anymore. We're talking about fear. Fear of instability. Fear of regret. Fear of being irresponsible. Fear of becoming one of those people who messed up their future. And fear is tricky. Because fear almost never introduces itself as fear. It introduces itself as caution, as maturity, as discipline, as being smart. So you don't challenge it. You respect it. You build your life around it. And one day, if you're not careful, you realize something awful. You weren't actually being guided by wisdom. You were being guided by anxiety with very good branding. Now, to be fair, this book is not saying blow your money. That's the lazy interpretation. That's the version people use when they want to dismiss it without actually confronting it. Because just spend more is easy to argue against. But that's not what the book is saying. What it's saying is much harder to dismiss. It's saying that money is not the thing you're trying to maximize. Life is. And if money is only useful because it can be converted into life, then the timing of that conversion matters just as much as the amount. That's the whole shift. Not more spending, better timing. And once you understand that, the whole game changes. Because suddenly the question isn't just, how much money do I need? It becomes, when is this money actually most valuable? That's a much sharper question. A much more dangerous one. Because the answer is almost never as late as possible. Let's make this real. Imagine two versions of the same experience. A spontaneous backpacking trip at 29 and a luxury resort vacation at 59. Now, are both technically travel? Sure. But are they the same experience? Not even close. Different body, different appetite, different friendships, different stage of life, different meaning. The problem is, we often treat experiences like they're transferable across time. Like if we postpone them, we can simply collect them later. But that's not how life works. You can delay the spending. You cannot always preserve the experience. That's the part people miss. And that's where Die with Zero stops being provocative and starts being painfully accurate. You can delay the spending. You cannot always preserve the experience. Think about your own life for a second. Not in a vague, philosophical way. In a painfully specific way. What are you assuming you'll still want later? What are you assuming you'll still be able to do later? What are you assuming the people you love will still be available for later? Because most people don't actually have a plan for later. They have a fantasy, a very emotionally comforting fantasy where their body still works the same, their parents are still healthy, their friends are still free, their kids are still little, their curiosity is still intact, their energy is still there, and they'll magically know how to live once the pressure finally eases. That fantasy is carrying a lot of weight in people's lives, and almost nobody checks whether it's true. This is where the book introduces one of its most powerful ideas, an idea that sounds simple, but changes the way you think about almost everything. The idea is this: experiences don't just have value in the moment, they keep paying you back. Think about the last truly meaningful memory you have. Not something you bought, something you lived. Maybe it was a trip. Maybe it was a late-night conversation. Maybe it was a road trip with people who don't even live near you anymore. Maybe it was something as simple as sitting with someone you love before life got complicated. Whatever it is, that moment is not over. It still exists inside you. You still revisit it. You still retell it. You still emotionally collect from it. That's what Bill Perkins calls a memory dividend. The idea that the right experiences keep returning value long after they end. And once you see that, something obvious becomes impossible to ignore. If experiences keep paying you over time, then having them earlier dramatically increases their total lifetime return. That's such a simple idea, and yet it quietly destroys a lot of modern life logic. Because now the question isn't just, was this worth the money? It becomes, how many years of emotional return will I get from this? That's a completely different way of thinking, and honestly, a much smarter one. Let's say you take an incredible trip at 28. You remember it at 31. You laugh about it at 35. You tell the story at 42. You revisit the photos at 50. You still feel something from it decades later. That one experience didn't happen once. It kept happening. That's what makes it valuable. Not just the week it occurred, but the emotional compound interest it created afterward. Now, compare that to delaying the exact same kind of experience until 61. Can it still be meaningful? Of course, but will it have the same tale of return? No. It can't. There's simply less runway left. Fewer years for the memory to keep paying you. That's what makes this idea so powerful. It's not anti-saving. It's anti-bad timing. And once you understand that, you start noticing how weirdly narrow most people's definition of return on investment really is. They only count what can be measured in money. They count interest, yield, market growth, portfolio performance. But they don't count the years a memory stays alive, the confidence an experience gives you, the relationship depth created by shared moments, the way one season of life can emotionally nourish the next. And that's a terrible accounting system, because it ignores some of the highest return things in a human life. This is where the book starts to become dangerous in the best way, because once you accept memory dividends, you can't keep pretending that later is always smart. Sometimes later is more expensive, not financially, existentially, because every year you delay a meaningful experience, you are not just postponing joy, you are shortening its total lifespan inside your life. And that's a very different cost, because now we have to ask a harder question. What else are you postponing that doesn't just wait patiently for you? What else in your life has an invisible expiration date? Maybe it's travel, maybe it's adventure, maybe it's deep time with your parents while they still feel like the age they are now. Maybe it's being physically playful with your kids. Maybe it's saying yes to the season of your life you're currently in, instead of living mentally in the next one. That's the thing. A lot of people think they're saving life for later. What they're actually doing is letting specific versions of life quietly expire. And this is where the book introduces another idea that should honestly bother more people than it does, because this is where it stops being about having fun and starts being about life design. The idea is this: not every experience belongs in every season of life. Some things are worth more at 30 than at 60, not because they're impossible later, because they are different later. That difference matters a lot. This is what the book frames through the idea of time buckets, thinking about life in phases and matching experiences to the periods when they'll matter most. And once you really think about that, it becomes incredibly hard to keep living vaguely, because vague people delay everything. Specific people notice windows. Here's what I mean. If you ask someone, what do you want to do with your life? You'll usually get very broad answers. Travel more, spend more time with family, have more freedom, enjoy life. But vague desires are easy to postpone forever, because they never become urgent. They never become scheduled. They never become now. But the second you make them specific, everything changes. Not travel more, but take a 10-day trip with your closest friend before both of your lives get too rigid to make it happen. Not spend more time with family, but take your father somewhere while he can still comfortably walk all day. Not be present with my kids, but protect the next 2 summers before they age out of wanting to spend that kind of time with me. That's not vague. That's a window. And windows create urgency. Most people don't need more motivation. They need more clarity about what is expiring. That's what creates movement. That's what turns someday into this year. Because the truth is, some of the most meaningful losses in life do not arrive as dramatic endings. They arrive as unnoticed last times. The last year your child still wants to hold your hand in public. The last phase where your parents still feel physically strong. The last stretch where your closest friends are all still in the same season of life. The last version of your own body that can say yes without negotiation. Those are not abstract losses. They are real, and they are happening all the time, quietly, without announcement, because the real tragedy isn't dying broke. It's dying full of unlived life. And if that line feels a little dramatic, good. It should. Because what's actually dramatic is how normal we've made this. How normal it is to spend years preparing for a life we never stop to schedule. How normal it is to assume we can keep pushing everything meaningful just a little further out. How normal it is to think later is a strategy. Later is not a strategy. Later is often just a socially acceptable form of avoidance. And that's the kind of sentence that stings because it's true. Now, this is usually the point where someone says, okay, but what about security? Fair question. A necessary one, because this is where people either misunderstand the book completely or finally understand what it's actually trying to say. And that difference matters a lot. This book is not anti-security. It's anti-overcorrection. It's not saying ignore the future. It's saying that a lot of people have quietly turned protecting the future into a full-time religion without ever asking what the future is actually for. That's the real issue, not prudence, worship. Because there is absolutely such a thing as not saving enough. That's real, that's dangerous, that causes suffering. But there is also something people almost never talk about. There is such a thing as saving too much for too late, and if you're in the audience for this book, that second mistake is probably much more relevant to your life than the first. That's why this book tends to hit a very specific type of person hardest, not the impulsive spender, not the chaotic risk-taker. It hits the competent person, the planner, the optimizer, the one who has spent years becoming very good at not messing up, because those people often build a hidden assumption into their life. If I just keep being disciplined a little longer, everything meaningful will still be waiting for me. And that assumption is doing a lot of damage, because discipline can build a beautiful life. But only if it knows when to stop sacrificing and start converting. That's the missing skill, not just earning, not just saving. Converting, turning money into actual life while it still matters. That is the skill almost nobody teaches. And that is exactly why this book feels so disruptive, because it exposes the fact that many people have gotten incredibly good at storing life and surprisingly bad at living it. And once you really understand that, you start seeing the same mistake everywhere. You see it in people who keep postponing travel because they want to do it properly later. You see it in parents who think quality time can simply be made up for once work gets easier. You see it in people who keep saying they'll take care of their health once life calms down, while their body is quietly collecting the cost of delay. You see it in people who have enough money to buy back some time, but keep living as if every hour must still be squeezed for output. That's what makes this book dangerous. It doesn't just challenge your financial habits. It challenges the emotional logic underneath them. Because once you admit that timing matters, a lot of your decisions start looking different and a little harder to defend. Take something as simple as free time. Most people say they value it. Almost everybody says they want more of it. But then they spend years using money to buy convenience while refusing to use money to buy back actual life. That's such a strange contradiction. You'll pay for upgraded devices, faster shipping, premium subscriptions, more comfort. But ask someone to spend money to reclaim a few hours a week of actual breathing room, and suddenly it feels indulgent. Why? Because a lot of people have unconsciously learned to treat time as less valuable than money. Even though time is the thing money is supposed to serve, that's backwards, and once you see it, it becomes hard to unsee. This is one of the deeper lessons hiding inside D with zero. Not every smart decision looks conservative. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is spend money to make your life more livable now. Not in a flashy way, in a functional way, a human way. Maybe that means outsourcing something that drains you. Maybe that means taking the extra day. Maybe that means paying for a little more space, a little more ease, a little more recovery. Not because you're lazy, because your life is not a machine that should only exist at maximum efficiency. And this is exactly where people who think of themselves as disciplined often get trapped, because they're excellent at justifying more effort, but very poor at justifying relief. They can always find a reason to keep pushing, always find a reason to delay rest, always find a reason to wait one more quarter, one more year, one more milestone, and eventually, if they're not careful, they build a life that is technically successful but emotionally undernourished. That's the phrase, emotionally undernourished, not collapsed, not broken, not failing, just weirdly underfed by your own existence. That is much more common than people admit, and if you've ever had that strange feeling that your life is fine but not fully yours, that may be part of what you're feeling. Not lack of achievement, lack of confusion. You've turned your life energy into income, but not enough of that income back into actual life. That's the leak. That's where the emptiness comes from. And once you start seeing it that way, something shifts. Because now you're not just asking whether a purchase is worth it. You're asking whether it creates a better life. That's a much better filter. Now, this is also where the book gets even more uncomfortable. Because once you accept that timing matters for your own life, you have to admit that timing matters for the people you love too. And this is where most people's idea of generosity gets quietly exposed. Because a lot of people imagine themselves as generous in the future. They'll give more later, help more later, be more available later, leave something meaningful behind later. And on paper, that sounds admirable. But this book asks a brutal question. What if later is too late to be maximally useful? Think about inheritance for a second. Most people think of inheritance as a final act of love, something noble, something responsible, something that proves you set your family up. But if your children receive that money when they're already 55 or 60, how much of their life does it really shape? How much does it actually help when compared to receiving meaningful support at 28 or 32 or 37? That's the question Bill Perkins forces you to confront. Not, did I leave something? But did I give it when it actually mattered? That's a very different standard, and a much more uncomfortable one. Because once again, this is not about amount. It's about timing, and timing changes utility a lot. A dollar is not equally powerful at every age. A gift is not equally life-changing at every stage. The same money can mean wildly different things depending on when it arrives. A down payment in your early 30s can reshape a decade. The same money arriving after most major life decisions have already been made. Still nice, but not transformational. That's the difference. And that difference matters. Now widen that idea beyond money. Because this applies to more than inheritance. It applies to attention, to presence, to support, to time, to your actual self. A lot of people imagine that what they owe their loved ones is financial provision. And yes, that matters. Of course it does. But if you really think through the logic of this book, there's a harder truth hiding underneath it. Sometimes the thing your family needs most from you is not more future money. It's more present life, more availability, more memory making, more actual you. That's not always easy to hear, especially for people whose entire identity has been built around providing. But it's true. And truth doesn't stop being true just because it threatens your self-image. Sometimes what your family needs most from you is not more future money. It's more present life. That line hits because almost everyone knows, somewhere deep down, that it's true, and yet modern life is built to make you ignore it. Because modern life rewards measurable sacrifice. Long hours are visible. Income is visible. Growth is visible. But what doesn't get publicly rewarded? Presence, slowness, attention, unhurried time. A memory that nobody can post on LinkedIn, and because those things don't look impressive from the outside, people keep underinvesting in them, even though they're often the exact things that matter most later. That's the trap. We build our lives around what is easy to measure, and then wonder why they feel emotionally incomplete. And once you understand this next part, you can never think about later the same way again, because there's a hidden assumption underneath almost every delay. And it sounds like this: I'll still be the same person later. That assumption is carrying way too much weight in people's lives, because you will not be the same person later, and neither will the people around you. Your body changes, your priorities change, your tolerance changes, your energy changes, your relationships change, your emotional landscape changes, even your appetite for adventure changes. That's not pessimism, that's reality. And reality matters, because the entire logic of postponement collapses the moment you realize later you is not simply current you with more money. Later you is a different person, living in a different body, inside a different season, with a different emotional texture to life. That changes everything, which brings us to one of the most quietly devastating ideas in this entire book. The idea that if you really want to live well, you have to stop treating life like one long timeline and start treating it like a series of seasons. Distinct seasons, each with its own windows, its own possibilities, its own losses, its own type of magic. That's what time bucketing is really about. Not productivity, not planning for the sake of planning. Awareness, awareness of what belongs when. Because if you think of your whole life as one giant open future, you'll delay everything. You'll keep assuming there's still plenty of time. You'll keep pushing meaningful things into some emotionally foggy category called later. But if you start seeing your life in seasons, something sharpens. Things become more real, more urgent, more alive. You stop saying, I want to travel more someday, and start saying, there are 2 or 3 years in front of me where this would mean something very specific. After that, the shape of my life changes. That's clarity. That's the kind of sentence that actually moves behavior. You stop saying, I should spend more time with my parents, and start saying, there is a current version of them that will never exist again. If I want memories with that version, I need to act while that version still exists. That's not guilt. That's awareness. And awareness is what turns good intentions into actual life. You stop saying, one day I'll slow down, and start saying, if I don't build some form of slowness into this chapter of my life, I may spend the next decade rehearsing a life I never enter. That's the difference. And that difference is everything. This is the moment where the book usually stops being theoretical for people, because now it's not about agreeing with an idea. Now it's about seeing your own life more clearly than you did 10 minutes ago. And that's much harder to escape, because information is easy to admire. Recognition is much harder to avoid, and what this book does at its best is force recognition. Not just I understand, but I see myself in this. That's why it lingers. That's why people keep thinking about it after the book is over. And that's why it's not really a finance book at all. It's a mortality book disguised as a money book. It's an identity book disguised as a spending book. It's a regret prevention book disguised as personal finance. That's what most summaries miss. And missing that is missing the whole point. Here's what most people take from this book: spend more, save less, enjoy life. That's the shallow version. That's the version that sounds catchy and changes almost nothing. Here's what they miss. This book is about recognizing that your life has invisible expiration dates built into it. Not just for your body, for your relationships, your seasons, your possibilities, your versions of self. And if you keep optimizing for safety without respecting timing, you can absolutely build a life that looks intelligent from the outside and feels quietly regretful from the inside. That is the real warning. And that is why this book matters. Now, let's bring everything together. Because if you leave this as a beautiful idea, it won't change anything. And this book deserves more than admiration. It deserves application. So what do you actually do with this? Not abstractly. Practically. Today. This week. This quarter. How do you use this without becoming reckless or performative or impulsive? That's the real test, because a good idea that doesn't survive contact with real life is just content, and this needs to become more than content. So here's a much better way to think. Stop asking, what do I want to do before I die? That question is too broad, too cinematic, too easy to postpone. Start asking, what experiences have a window? That is a much more useful question, much more actionable, much more honest. Maybe for you, that's taking a trip with a specific person before life pulls you into different directions. Maybe it's changing the way you work before your 30s disappear into one giant blur of output. Maybe it's spending money to create more margin while your children still live in your house. Maybe it's getting serious about your health now, because your future enjoyment is sitting inside the quality of your current body. That's another thing this book gets right. Your ability to enjoy life is not just a money issue. It's a health issue too, and health quietly determines the quality of almost every future experience. That matters a lot, because some people are financially planning for a future body they are not physically preserving. That is a tragic mismatch. So if you really want to use this book well, here are 3 things worth doing. Not eventually. Now. First, write down 3 experiences you keep mentally storing in later. Not 10, not 20. 3. And next to each one, write this. What age or season of life does this belong to, if I'm being honest? That question alone can change behavior, because once you put a window around something, delay becomes harder to justify. Second, look at one area where money could buy you back. Actual life, not comfort, not status. Life. Maybe that means fewer hours. Maybe that means help. Maybe that means one decision that gives you more energy, more margin, more attention, more room to be a person. That is not irresponsible. That is exactly what money is for. Third, pick one relationship that deserves memory dividends while it still can create them. A parent, a partner, a child, a close friend, and ask a very blunt question. What memory am I assuming will still have time to make later? Then move that memory forward. That's it. Not forever, just forward. That's how life changes, not through philosophy alone, through movement. And if that feels weirdly emotional, good. It should, because this book is emotional. It's just emotionally disguised as logic. That's why it sneaks up on people. It enters through spreadsheets and leaves you questioning your life. That's why it works. Now, if all of this has been building pressure in your chest a little, that's probably a sign the book is doing what it's supposed to do. Because the point is not to make you feel guilty. The point is to make you feel awake. There's a big difference. Guilt freezes people. Awareness moves them. And this book, at its best, is not trying to shame you for how you've lived. It's trying to interrupt the autopilot before more of your life disappears inside it. That's a gift. Even if it doesn't feel comfortable at first, because the truth is, a lot of people are not one dramatic mistake away from regret. They are one unnoticed decade away from it. 1 decade of postponing. 1 decade of optimizing. 1 decade of saying after this season. 1 decade of storing life instead of converting it. That's all it takes. And the reason that should bother you is because it happens to very smart people all the time. But the deepest idea in this entire book has nothing to do with retirement. It has to do with something much more personal, something much harder to hear. And once you really hear it, you can't go back to thinking about time the same way again. You do not die once. You die in stages. The version of you that could backpack across a country with almost no plan dies. The version of you that could pull an all-nighter with close friends and still feel alive the next morning dies. The version of you that could spend an entire Saturday on the floor with your small child and not think about your phone dies. The version of you whose parents still looked and sounded exactly like they do right now dies. The version of you that still has this exact body, this exact appetite, this exact emotional shape dies. And none of those deaths feel dramatic when they happen. That's what makes them dangerous. They arrive quietly, as transitions, as aging, as busyness, as just how life goes. But they are losses, real ones. And if you don't notice them, you don't just lose time, You lose versions of life that can never be recreated. That is the deepest truth in this book. Not spend more. Not retire earlier. Some parts of your life do not wait for you, and once they're gone, no amount of money can buy them back. That is why the book lands so hard. Because at its deepest level, it is not about wealth. It is about whether you are awake enough to recognize what is passing through your hands while you are busy trying to secure the future. That's the whole thing. That's the real confrontation, not whether you have enough, whether you are paying attention. So now we come back to the beginning, to the fear that most people think this whole conversation is about, the fear of running out of money. And yes, that fear is real. It matters. It should be respected. But there's another fear that deserves equal seriousness. A quieter one, a more socially invisible one. The fear of reaching a later version of your life and realizing you were careful in all the right ways, except the ones that actually made life feel alive. That's the fear this book wants to wake up. Not panic, awareness. Not recklessness, precision. Not guilt. Timing. That's the shift. That's the whole shift. And once you feel that shift, you start living differently. Not all at once, but specifically. You stop worshiping later. You stop assuming every meaningful thing can wait. You stop treating your life like a draft. You start noticing windows. You start respecting seasons. You start using money the way it was always meant to be used. As a servant, not a scoreboard, not a source of identity, not a place to hide. A servant, a tool for turning your finite life into something richer, fuller, more lived. That is a radically better way to think, and honestly, a much more human one. So let's end where this book really wants to leave you. Not with a neat lesson, not with a productivity takeaway, not with a 10 things I learned, with a question, a real one, a dangerous one. A question that might follow you around for a while, and probably should. What part of your life are you assuming will still be there later? Not vaguely, specifically. What part? A relationship, a dream, a season, a version of your body, a relationship, a version of yourself? What are you quietly counting on still being available, simply because you haven't made time for it yet? That's the question. And if this book did its job, you won't be able to answer that casually, because the point was never to die with $0. The point was to die with as little unlived life as possible, and those are not the same thing, not even close. If this changed how you think about money, timing, and the life you keep postponing, stay with this channel, because the next ideas worth learning are not about making more noise. They're about making better decisions before more of your life slips by unnoticed.